Good evening. It's 8 p.m. local time here in the Polish capital. You're watching World News Tonight, and I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. Over the weekend, Moldova held two of its most important votes in recent years, a presidential election and a referendum on its European course. The pro-European camp managed to win by a slight margin, with allegations of Russia paying off voters to meddle in favor of the opposition socialist candidate. Later in the show, I will discuss this topic with my guest, Elizabeth Bra. More on that coming up, but first, let's take a look at the headlines. U.S. Defense Secretary announces a new aid package for Ukraine. EU ministers discuss the future of fishing and farming in the bloc. In Russia, opposing the state too often ends with a case of sudden death syndrome. In Moldova, is Moldova on a straight path to the European Union? Yesterday's referendum was to be a formality and prove Moldovans want their country to be in the EU. The pro-EU camp won, but by a very slim majority. Our correspondent Marek Steele is in Chisinau, the capital of Moldova, and has been following the events. Good evening, Marek. So what can you tell us about the outcome? What do we know so far?
Good evening, Claudia. Well, the presidential vote here in Moldova was accompanied by a very important referendum. The government in Chisinau asked the people of Moldova whether they wanted to add EU accession, EU membership for Moldova as a strategic goal to their constitution. Well, the outcome was, it was a really tight race, as 50.5% of those who took part in the vote voted for, and while against, there were 49.5% of votes. So there was only a difference of 14,000 votes between 50.5 and 49.5. What's more interesting is that initially there were more votes against, so of the pro-Russian camp and not pro-European camp, but the votes from abroad and the fact that they were counted later changed this. Initially, polls suggested that 60% of Moldovans would vote in favor, so this is a bit of a backlash for the government here in Moldova. Just to give you a little bit of background, Moldova is a post-Soviet country. It gained independence over 30 years ago. There's only 2.5 million people living here. It borders Romania, an EU member, on the one side, and Ukraine on the other. Part of its territory is occupied by pro-Russian separatists, and that region is called Transnistria. But in 2022, Moldova firmly took a pro-EU path when it applied for EU membership, and it was granted EU candidate status that same year. Accession negotiations for Moldova started this summer, so Moldova has been on a pro-EU path for 2 years now. There's been a lot of response to the outcome of the referendum and the presidential election that accompanied. Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, wrote, "Congratulations to the people of Moldova and to you, Maia Sandu," so the president. "You've done it again. In the face of Russia's hybrid tactics, Moldova shows that it is independent, it is strong, and it wants a European future." As with many votes and referendums across Europe, the OSCE, so the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, has been monitoring the vote. And this is what the organization had to say about the vote in Moldova. Let's take a listen.
Yesterday's presidential election and constitutional referendum were well managed, and contestants campaigned freely in an environment characterized by concerns over illicit foreign interference and active disinformation efforts.
So President Sandu, who won the first round of the election, the pro-EU candidate incumbent president, said that there was clear evidence that criminal groups aimed to buy 300,000 votes, a fraud on an unprecedented scale. This is what she said. And there has been documented evidence of vote buying and busing Moldovans into, for instance, the Moldovan embassy in Russia to cast their votes. What's the aftermath of the election? Well, the government now can amend the constitution and add EU membership as a strategic goal. It opens the doors to joining the bloc as the accession negotiations will continue. But accession is still very far away, as Moldova has to implement many reforms to become an EU member. And this thin margin could indicate that Moldovans are still not decided if they want east or west. Back to you, Claudia.
Thank you so much, Marek. Marek Steele coming to us from Chisinau in Moldova. Keep us updated. The EU referendum results in Moldova were closely contested, but the presidential election with ballots cast on the same day showed greater disparities among the voters. Maia Sandu won the first round, but she now has a serious contender in the person of Alexandru Stoyanoglu. Paweł Trzaskowski has more.
Maia Sandu, supported by Western leaders, got a better result than expected, with 42% of the votes.
Infuriate Moscow, impress Europe, save her country once again. That's who Maia Sandu is. A great leader and a brave nation.
But so did the runner-up, Alexandru Stoyanoglu, who went from the forecast 9 to almost 26%. Such results mean that a second round is needed.
This is a blow for the incumbent president and her pro-European policy.
Following the announcement of partial results, Sandu said that both votes were swayed by outside influence. But when asked about outright Russian interference, she did not point directly to Moscow.
What's not normal is to have a situation where criminal groups are bribing voters. This is a relatively new phenomenon for Moldova. This is a dangerous phenomenon for any democracy.
According to Moldovan authorities, up to 300,000 votes were planned to be bought.
There's news out that about 100,000 euros were spent to actually bribe voters to give a vote against EU accession and against the current president, Maia Sandu.
And with referendum results on razor's edge, this influence could have made the difference. When it comes to Sandu's main opponent, he chose to boycott the referendum.
I did not participate in the referendum. I do not support the position of the current government, which came up with an idea not related to the European Union itself. This is a referendum to change the constitution.
Stoyanoglu, a former prosecutor general, also during Sandu's presidential tenure, might be a political newcomer, but he is the first opponent to seriously challenge Sandu's leadership. Supported by the pro-Russian Socialist Party and with Igor Dodon, Moldova's president from 2016 to 2020, ceding his potential electorate to him, Stoyanoglu became the opposition's unified candidate. In order not to discourage left-wing voters and to win some of Sandu's electorate, he tries to portray himself as a man of the political center.
He's a man who can be accepted by everyone. This is why the post-communist party, the Socialist Party, decided on such a move.
And 26% of votes put even more wind in his sails.
The authorities prepared in advance for victory. It suppressed and banned opposition media, imposed censorship, established one-party control over the Central Electoral Commission, launched fake sociological polls, abolished the Institute of Election Observers, and abused administrative resources, including external ones. The result? A resounding and shameful failure.
Although Sandu is still poised to win, the tight EU referendum results might mean a tougher battle for her in the presidential runoff. The second round is scheduled for November 3rd.
Washington is providing another military aid package to Ukraine, this time worth $400 million. The news was announced by U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin during his visit to Kyiv. Jeremy Hołodniuk reports.
President, this is Secretary. More ammunition, military equipment and weapons will soon reach Ukraine.
The United States remains committed to keeping up this support. And so I'm pleased to announce today the commitment of a $400 million presidential drawdown package to provide your forces with additional munitions, armored vehicles, and anti-tank weapons.
Austin's visit came right after a fresh wave of Russian attacks across the country, which left dozens wounded, a stark everyday reality of Ukrainian citizens and confirmation that the country needs help.
We discussed a lot of important things about victory plan, about preparing for winter, it's our air defense capabilities.
Lloyd Austin's visit also comes at a time when President Zelensky is pushing his victory plan internationally, with one of the main points of the plan being Ukraine's invitation to NATO. Some observers question its feasibility.
The US and Germany fear Russia's reaction, fear this what they call escalation from Russia if Ukraine is allowed to join NATO. So de facto, Russia, the Kremlin, has a veto over Ukraine's membership of NATO.
The trip to Kyiv marks Austin's fourth and potentially last visit to the country, as in just 2 weeks the US will choose its new president, sparking concerns over Washington's further support for Ukraine.
He decided probably to visit Kyiv to give additional assurances to Ukraine in this grey time. And with grey, I understand the time before US elections, where basically no real political decisions are at this moment made.
The new aid package is a boost for Ukraine's defense, at least for some time. Meanwhile, the eyes of the world are set on Washington ahead of the election.
The Agriculture and Fisheries Commission of the European Council is meeting in Luxembourg to set new quotas and discuss European policy for the coming years. Looming above the talks are deep divisions on subsidies and the ever-present risk of unrest among farmers.
Scenes like these are still giving European politicians sleepless nights. Within the entire EU, farmer protests have been both frequent and forceful. Contentious topics for the meeting of agricultural ministers include fishing quotas and fertilizer limits. The most glaring issue for agriculture is the so-called Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP, which is up for renewal in 2027. The CAP is the single largest policy of the European Union, taking up close to 1/3 of the total EU 7-year budget. For the new CAP, Western European countries are eager to change subsidy regulations, tying them to specific conservation and modernization goals. Central and Eastern Europe are generally more into keeping the existing system and are calling for fewer demands on them. Agriculture will also have to contribute to the EU's environmental policy, the European Green Deal. Farmers are not happy that subsidies might depend on adhering to green policies. They argue they have been foisted upon them and have little regard for their needs and worries.
If we have to share in the costs of the Green Deal or other programs and not in the benefits, then for us that's unfair. If, for example, the Dutch manage to halve their fertilizer use, that is an enormous amount for which they get paid subsidies, and for us that would be far lower.
Sławomir Kalinowski of the Polish Academy of Sciences says that the Green Deal has become a symbol of general discontent around the stricter rules, mainly due to poor communication.
That has caused a misunderstanding of what the European Green Deal is, why it's needed, and what benefits it brings to both the environment and farmers. I think that part of the limits when it comes to emissions, but also use of pesticides and plant protection, will be relaxed.
Farmer unrest has made individual member states extend or negotiate exceptions on the limits set by the European Commission. These include areas such as allowed nitrogen emissions or the legal use of certain pesticides and herbicides. But the Commission is not keen to hand out such exceptions.
Question marks are hanging over a long list of sudden deaths in Russia, including oil tycoons, since the country's invasion of Ukraine. It comes as another former manager of a well-known company is found dead.
In Moscow, a mystery over a supposed suicide. This is 64-year-old Mikhail Rogachev, former vice president of now-defunct Russian oil giant Yukos, who was found dead after falling from his 10th-story apartment in Russia's capital. Russian news agencies say his death is being treated as a suicide, that he had cancer and left a note, with police now investigating. But those close to Rogachev are said to strongly deny these claims. In a clip posted to Telegram, the audio is believed to be the voice of his wife.
In the morning, we had breakfast. Everything was normal. He said, "I'm going to lie down." I said, "Mish, Natasha is leaving. Say goodbye." And there was silence. So I went to check. He wasn't in the bedroom. And then I looked in the bathroom. The door was open and there were those papers.
Was this tragedy then, or foul play? One expert has no doubt about the answer.
It looks like a real absurdity happening once again. Of course, for internal Russian purposes, it may be presented as a natural death. But there are so many memes and jokes on the internet that it goes beyond all human imagination.
It's just the latest in a string of strange deaths of President Vladimir Putin's dissidents, many of which have been put down to the so-called sudden Russian death syndrome.
Of course, the Kremlin has experience in eliminating unreliable elites or those who betray it. I believe that some of the people who have died indeed had access to information that could have harmed energy security or exposed secrets related to the outflow of financial resources.
In fact, a number of Russian energy executives have reportedly died in mysterious circumstances over the past 2 years, including high-ranking officials from Gazprom and Lukoil. According to the Kremlin, there have been falls, heart attacks preceded by shamanic rituals, murder-suicides and sudden deaths. All happen to involve big bosses at large Russian companies.
In Russia, there are no coincidences, no unfortunate accidents.
The Kremlin denies all wrongdoing, though Putin is known for cracking down on those who speak out against him, with opposition leader Alexei Navalny one of the most high-profile critics to face his wrath. Navalny died earlier this year in a brutal penal colony in the Arctic Circle.
Fethullah Gulen, accused of the 2016 attempted coup in Turkey, has died. Initially a friend of Turkish President Erdogan, he would go on to become his main enemy. Gulen lived in exile in the United States since 1999. Turkish Muslim leader Fethullah Gulen has died at the age of 83 in Pennsylvania in the United States after suffering from multiple health problems. Ankara held him responsible for orchestrating the attempted coup in Turkey on July 15, 2016. The cleric was a one-time ally of President Erdogan from 2002 until 2013, but their relationship soured when he exposed alleged corruption in Erdogan's inner circle. After the July 15 coup attempt, Gulen's movement was labeled a terrorist organization by Ankara and targeted by broad crackdown, with 130,000 public officials dismissed, almost 77,000 people arrested, and hundreds of businesses, schools, and media organizations tied to Gulen closed. The cleric moved to the United States in 1999, shortly after being indicted in Turkey. Alongside his other efforts, Gulen was known to have established a network of educational institutions promoting his ideas around the world. During the parallel presidential vote and the EU referendum taking place in Moldova, the pro-EU camp triumphed by the slimmest of margins, while the presidential poll went to a second round. Why is the Moldovan vote so important, not only domestically but also internationally? And what are we to expect from the second round of presidential elections on November the 3rd? Joining me now is Elizabeth Bross, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and the author of Goodbye Globalization. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
I would like to begin by taking a look at a quote from Maia Sandu, the sitting president of Moldova. During the counting of the votes on Sunday, she said, I quote, "Moldova has faced an unprecedented assault on our country's freedom and democracy, both today and in recent months." In what sense were the events of last weekend an assault on democracy, and where do we go from here now?
So what Maia Sandu was referring to was the interference that she reported had taken place by a hostile state that she didn't mention, but which is thought to refer to Russia. Really an orchestrated interference campaign in the Moldovan elections that saw people being paid to vote against the referendum proposal for a closer alignment with the European Union, or a pro-EU path. And that is really quite extraordinary. The president was talking about 300,000 votes that were targeted in this way. That's a lot in a small country. And we saw in the election result, in the referendum result, it was extremely narrow, as you said, with a victory for the pro-EU side. But the victory could have been a lot bigger if there hadn't been this election interference. So that's something that is a very serious issue that other countries should pay attention to as well.
Do you think that the tight result could potentially herald a new period of sort of a political instability and protest in the country?
It certainly can. And with any tight election results, you will have people saying, well, my vote wasn't counted properly, there has been interference and so forth. In this case, the president obviously said quite clearly there had been interference, but it's always dangerous to have this type of an election result, even when there is no interference, simply because so many people will doubt the legality of the outcome. And you also have then almost half of the country's population being against the outcome. But I think this goes far beyond Moldova. The fact that there was this election interference and quite blatant election interference involving payments for votes in a particular for a particular choice suggests that the country that was behind it, which again we believe to be Russia, is willing to take this risk, even being identified as engaging in election interference to get the result it wants, or at the very least to cast doubts on the outcome of the election.
I would like to bring some words by Dennis Senusa, who is of the expert group at Germany's University of Gießen, and he recently called Moldova a potential swing state between pro-Russian and pro-European trajectories. What is your opinion on this statement?
Well, this is a swing state that has swung already from a more pro-Russian direction to a more pro-European direction under the current president. And this is why this election was so important. Essentially, the president had asked the country to decide which way do you want to swing. Do you want to swing the pro-Russian way or a pro-European way, which is why the referendum was crucial. And it's really about the future of the country, which direction they want to go. And this is clearly also why it mattered so much to Russia. Russia is not keen to see Moldova go in a pro-European direction. And it's quite unusual to have referendums on issues this fundamental. In Switzerland, where you have more referendums where those the issues put to people involve much smaller decisions, but this is clearly an existential issue for Moldova, and the president wanted people to decide whether to go with Europe or go with Russia.
As you mentioned in our conversation before, you spoke about Moldova as being a very small country, and those 300,000 votes that could be paid for could potentially swing that result. And as we look at the country, it's around 2.5 million people in total, and it's a relatively small country. What would you say are the specific reasons of why is it so important to Russia and the EU, and why the eyes are currently on Moldova when it comes to these elections?
Well, it's important because so many countries that used to belong to the Russian sphere of influence, both within the Soviet Union and within the Warsaw Pact, so many of those countries have said we want to go in a European direction, and they have indeed, like Poland and other countries, joined not just the EU but NATO. So the number of countries that are keen to side with Russia is quite small, and as a result, every country that entertains the notion or the idea of going in a more pro-European direction is one country too much for Russia, which is why we have seen Russia being so leaning so heavily on Georgia to side with Russia, and now we are seeing Russia again interfere in Moldova. It's not the first time, but this is the first time we have seen such a concerted and really quite open attempt to swing an election outcome in Moldova.
I'm just having a quick look at the results of the referendum. As we've mentioned before, they're far from ideal. Instead of 60% pro-EU target, they reached 50.26%. And Kamil Caus from the Center for Eastern European Studies, he said that this was somewhat a PR failure of the pro-Western cohort in Moldova. Do you think that the results of the referendum could actually predict the results of the second round of the presidential election?
It is fascinating to see these two elections being coupled. They are different. It's one referendum and one election, but yet, because they took place on the same date, involving a president who wants to steer the country in a pro-European direction and a referendum where people were asked about that direction, it is coupled, and it will be fascinating to see whether people are so frightened by the outcome of the referendum, or so close that they sort of swing behind President Sandu and say we don't want to leave any room for election manipulation by Russia, or by contrast, whether they say, maybe I'll stay home because this is just too difficult, too complicated. It's difficult. No, I think the former will be the case, especially since the majority of Moldovans seems to be behind a pro-European direction to a much larger extent than the referendum result suggested. I think many more will vote for Sandu to make sure that she gets re-elected as president.
Mm-hmm. The situation in Moldova could be potentially a reason for concern. In what ways do you think could Western democracies actually protect democratic processes and assist Moldovan government while maintaining electoral balance?
The most important thing to do in countries that are exposed to interference is to educate the public. And clearly, the European Union should not come to Moldova to educate the public. It's for Moldova itself to educate the public. But one really important issue is to help educate journalists, who are really the pillar of as you know, since you work for a television station yourself, journalists are the pillar of factual information in free and open societies. That's something where we can help Moldovan journalists, Moldovan news outlets do the best possible job they can in a very difficult situation. We can also help train Moldovan officials in the police, in state agencies, and so forth, to make sure Moldova is as robust as possible, as resilient as possible to the interference attempts that will continue to come in its direction.
Mm-hmm. As we look at this dynamic between Russia and Moldova, it still regards Moldova as the near abroad. And we know that Russia keeps hundreds of troops in the breakaway region of Transnistria. Just potentially, if things escalated quickly, could we actually expect Russian military interference?
There has already been Russian military interference in Moldova, and I think we are likely to see it again, probably not at this moment, but if Moldova continues to go in a pro-European direction, Russia is likely to interfere somehow. It doesn't. That wouldn't necessarily involve Russian troops. It could involve paid thugs who are paid to create disorder in Moldova. Russia rarely involves itself in a sort of totally open manner when it engages in interference. So I think we may see more of that, and that is a serious issue for a relatively poor country like Moldova that doesn't have particularly well-equipped institutions. And that's why it also matters so much, if we want to help Moldova, for us to help the Moldovan governments train its officials, and indeed for us to help train members of civil society, journalists, business people, and others.
Elizabeth Bra, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you.
And so this would be all the latest news for now, but please stay tuned here on TVP World, as we will be bringing you more news and features in time to come. Good night.